Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you to the PACT team. And thanks all of you for coming. Thanks to all those online as well coming. And thanks most of all to the two respondents, Aparna and Rinku, for reading through. And I look forward to the conversation that we'll have when I'm done. There's roughly two things that I'll try and do. Discussing a book, even a short one like this, is a difficult task. And what I'll do is I'll start with the title, the provocative title that I've given my book. I'll try to explain and justify the title, and then I'll try and I'll try and make one stab at explaining the manner in which what I'm calling the communal constitution fights into contemporary constitutional practice and constitutional debate. Right now, to start with this title, what is the communal constitution? I thought a good place to get into explaining this title would be to start with the cover itself. Now, if there's one part of this book that I have absolutely no reservations about, it is its cover. I think it's absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. It's put together by a Delhi-based artist called Jindal, and it's an adaptation of Nandalal Bose's artwork for the Constitution. Right? I'm guessing this is familiar to those of you at least in the room, right? But do any of you recognize the three figures on the on the cover? Ram, Sita, and Lakshman, right? So I want to. I mean, this is the picture that adorns the fundamental rights chapter of our Constitution, and it's a scene from the Ramayana, and it's by invoking the figure of Rama that I thought I could start trying to present the bite of what I'm calling the communal constitution. Right now, could I just go to the next slide? Now, there are various ways of being with Rama. Here's one that I'm most familiar with. This is a poem that I've picked. It's a song that I've picked up from a TV series, Patal Lok. It's also sung by Birla, Tipanya, in various places. There's also a Bangalore, Shabnam Virmani, Bangalore-based artist who also sings the song rather often in her public performances. Right. So the song is Sakala Hans mein Ram Biraje, Ram bina koi dame nahi, Sab Brahmand mein Jyot ka vasa, Ram ko sumiro puja nahi. Right. Now this, I'm guessing this is a really familiar way in which Ram has, Ram speaks, right, to many of us, right. So he is, of course, I don't know how deeply Ram speaks to us as a cultural figure, in middle class settings such as ours. But even so, he's one of the most important, figures in one of the most important of our epic traditions. He's an ideal, son, a doting husband, a valiant warrior. There's something absolutely, there's something about perfectibility that Ram embodies, right? And that's the form in which Ram speaks to many of us, in the broader cultural civilizational terrain that most of us inhabit. Alongside this, there is also another Ram that has grown up in our political discourse, a rather more, excluding Ram, right? And that's the Ram that is the emblem of the emblem of an excluding nation, as it were, right? A Ram that that mans the boundaries, as it were, between the inside and the outside of the nation, and it's this tension between the excluding Ram and this including Ram that I thought we could, that I thought I could use to frame, what I'm calling India's, that I thought I could use to frame this, the title, as it were. This, what is it that is communal about our Constitution? It's this excluding part of the way in which Ram excludes, right? The way in which he identifies the people, separates them from their enemies, and becomes an emblem of an excluding nationalism that I want to focus upon. And I'm imagining that this nationalizing story in which figures like Ram and broader civilizational traditions that are tied to our that figures like Ram and broader aspects of our civilization tradition are pulled into an excluding nationalism that I want to pull into what I'm calling the communal constitution, right? Now, so what I'm trying to say, so this nationalization of Ram, as it were, I'm hoping is a relatively, I'm hoping it's reasonably accessible to us in some form or the other. There's this contrast between a civilization of Ram and a nationalizing Ram. The nationalizing Ram is what I want to, is what I think I'm tracking in this book. And when we talk about this nationalizing Ram, very often, we are, we draw on socio-political movements, right? We draw on socio-political movements like the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. That is what we sort of lean on when we try and characterize this nationalizing element through which aspects of our religious civilization traditions is being nationalized, right? But what I'm trying to say is that this, there is some part of this nationalization project that is also, part of, that is also internal to law, that it is, that it is part of our legal and constitutional imagination, and it's that it's that manner of, it's that manner in which this nationalizing parochial element, it's that manner in which this parochial Ram, this excluding Ram, is pulled into our constitutional imagination that I'm trying to trace in this book, right? And I'm trace the next slide, and I trace this through a speculative hypothesis that that tries to pull together what I'm calling three constituent dispositions in the colonial state that preceded our constitution. So I'm trying to say that this there is the communal constitution I am sort of associating with a nationalizing tendency in in legal imagination. And this nationalizing tendency in legal imagination, I'm trying to characterize as a communal constitution. And this communal constitution, I'm trying to get a grasp of through these three constituent dispositions in the colonial state, right? Which then I argue, carries on into our independent constitution, right? So what I'll do is go through, so I'll try to characterize this colonial constitution, this communal constitution, or this nationalizing constitution through these three axes, largely detailed in the introductory chapter. And they are toleration of religious traditions by the colonial state as a particular kind of forbearance given to religions and religious traditions. There's social, and each of these temporarily follow each other as well, right? So toleration is the first sort, is the first attempt to manage and discipline religion. It's followed temporarily by social reform, and then subsequently by what I'm calling communal constitutional representation, right? So these are each axes of understanding the way in which the colonial state relates to religion, nationalizes religion, and communalizes religion, right? So that's roughly what I'm trying to do in the introduction. And I'm saying that collectively, that becomes the high water mark of the colonial state, against which our independence project try to push back against. But there are elements of this imagination that continues to be with us, which is what I trace in the book, right? So what I'm doing right now is giving you some characterization of this communal constitution, right? What is it, right? And I want to start with toleration. Next slide. And toleration is, one of the oldest dispositions of the colonial state vis-a-vis religion. You see it right from the, right from the first attempt by the colonial state to engage with religion. You can talk of it in terms of the way in which the colonial state characterized sati, the way in which they pull together our personal law traditions. It continues with the Queen's Declaration of 1857, and even after the passing of the Raj, toleration and forbearance of Indian religious traditions has been a cornerstone of colonial policy towards Indian religious traditions. Right now, very often this this disposition of toleration, as I mentioned on this slide, has been dismissed as as pragmatic, as preserving, as necessary to preserve order, as part of the classificatory impulse of the colonial state, and so on and so forth. Right? There's work by Lata Mani or Bernard Cohn, or there's a whole range of post-colonial scholarship that seems to take roughly that position. Right? Now, against that kind of position, I'm trying to draw something of a methodological, normative, conceptual consistency in the way in which toleration bites onto and transforms and reorganizes Indian religious tradition. Right? Next slide, please. And here's an example that gives that gives you a sense of what is going on when toleration confronts religion and is, and reorganizes religions as I'm claiming it does. Right? So just if I could just read through this, it says it is solely because the burning of, and this is about sati, right? So it's about how to deal and respond to sati. And there is the impulse of toleration that is running through this paragraph. It's so stated as well here. It is, and let me just go through it. It is solely because the burning of widows has its foundation, whether erroneously or not, in the religion of this country, that the British laws do not and ought not interfere. Right? Infanticide. So this is the contrast. We can't interfere with sati. However, we can interfere with infanticide because it has no religious basis. Right? So that's the sort of distinction that I'm trying to sort of pull out over here. Next slide. Right. Next slide, please. Right. So, what is this normative disposition that normative methodological disposition that I'm claiming one can see in toleration? There are certain practices that are identified as religious. They identified as as religious. They identified as religious first. The religious practices are then tied in with certain foundational axioms or truths, and those truths very often are found in a textual tradition. Very often the Sanskrit textual tradition, and that then becomes the basis of toleration. Right? So I don't know if many of you have read this essay by Lata Mani. But there's a beautiful essay that she's written on sati, where she talks about good satis and bad satis. Right? This is the earliest disposition. This is before sati was banned. The colonial state had to decide which satis ought to be tolerated. Right? So a good sati had all of these marks. Right? It was tolerated in this unique, distinct form. Right? Where the colonial state went out seeking axiomatic, truth-based foundations for practices. And then it sort of tied these truths of practices to a people, and it's that dimension of toleration that I want to flag and point out for your attention, right? As a first disposition or constituent axis that could I just go back to the previous slide, please? That as a first, dimension of the communal constitution that I want to identify. Indian, social and religious practices continue to be messy up to this day. This process of managing and disciplining religious practices in this form is not successful, even up to this day, even at, even in, against the success of this nationalist project, with the BJP government in the center and many parts of India. But this messiness continues to remain. But nonetheless, there is this disposition of toleration that that organizes the manner in which the state relates to religion, most likely. Social reform, is the next aspect or next axis, even temporarily comes after toleration in my story that I want to focus on. This is an extremely difficult area to characterize, as it were. It's a vast socio-legal canvas that spans about a century and a half or thereabouts. I've outlined some of these, some landmarks in that story, in the slide. So, social reform is associated with some of these legal developments. And what I'm trying to argue is this is the moment, at which Indians internalize the disposition, the methodological orientation or the disciplining that toleration entails. Right. So that's roughly what I've tried to put out in this slide. And the internalization of Indians of this disciplining orientation means that they can argue for reform. They can argue for reforms as, especially the elite sections of Indian society, will argue for reforms as mediating for Indian society writ large. But Indian society writ large is more or less divided into buckets identified Hindu and Muslim. And so all of these reforms starting from this period going all the way up to 1950 are either Hindu reform or Muslim reform. Right? So there's a kind of discipline that toleration puts on the table that reform sort of deepens in Indian imagination. Right? So Indians begin to internalize the discipline that toleration sets in. Right? Now, this then brings up the third of the of the dispositions or axes along which I want to explore the communal constitution. And once again, this is the moment in which these, in which the identities disciplined by toleration and reform get pulled into the structure of the colonial state. Right? Now, that's what, again, I've just identified moments or aspects of this incorporation of Indian identity into the colonial state. There is, there's separate electorates, limited electorates, community electorates. They're classic examples of the form in which Indians were incorporated into the colonial state. Now, here, it's not just religious identities that were pulled into this representation project, but I'm choosing to emphasize primarily on religion. Even if one looks at the big development in the at least one big development in the subcontinent, that is partition, it was it came out of the process. One could argue that it came out of a process of representation in the colonial state by way of separate communal electorates, right? And what this does, there's a complicated story here, but what I want to point out about the logic of representation is that there are very strong opinions that colonial representation generated. It undoubtedly opened space for Indians to be represented in British government. Indian opinion largely was framed in this manner, saying that it was a British rules to divide India. But even as that is the case, as I try to detail in the introductory chapter and in subsequent chapters as well, there is something of a there's something of a consistent political sociology about India that that one can see in this effort to represent Indians in the colonial state, right? So well before constitutional representation emerged as a problem, as a problem to be solved in the 20th century, Macaulay talks about it, even Edmund Burke talks about it, the fact that India eventually has to be handed back, right? And that is something that gains steam, with 1909, 1919, 1935. And there is, there is a sociology, there's a political sociology on the basis of which this idea of handing India back is founded on. And that is pedagogy, as I tried to mention, which is that India lacks political will. India is divided into these various entities, but precisely these identities does not allow India to come together as one unified political will. And therefore, it is the duty of the British to mentor India as a pedagogue towards some kind of political unity, right? So that's but this mentoring happens in distinct communal groups, right? So Indians can be drawn into British constitutional government, but as Hindus, as Muslims, as Marathas, as landlords, and so on and so forth. So that's the third of the axes that I want to point out, and it is, this really is the high water mark, of the colonial efforts to I suppose this pedagogical project is in fact the colonial constitution, right? The colonial constitution that incorporates Indians as different communally divided identities is the colonial constitution, and by extension, because Indians are drawn into that colonial state as communities, it is also the communal constitution, right? So that's it's a rather jagged arrival at why I have titled my book India's Communal Constitution. It is the colonial state's characterization of how they thought they ought to constitutionalize India, right? It happened bit by bit over 2 centuries. Very often, discussions on constitutionalization start here. The processes of 1919, 1909, 1919, 1935. But I've tried to sort of talk about where these identities, I tried, where these identities, as they are drawn into the colonial state, come from in the developments that I'm characterizing, reform and toleration before it. Right? So, next slide, please. So this really is the communal constitution that I've tried to, to characterize. It's a disposition in the colonial state to constitutionalize the will of the Indian people as embodiment of religious community or community. Right? Now, and Indians obviously responded to this, to this pedagogical impetus. That it has within it a telos, right? That Indians lack political will today, but they could achieve it later, right? And the various axes this telos could be actualized. One, is the fact that you acquire a political will as an ethno-majoritarian, and that's the Pakistan project, as I'm very roughly characterizing it. And the Indian effort was to forge a multi-ethnic liberal state. Right now, a range of scholars. Could I have the next slide, please? A range of scholars, whether it's Gautam Bhatia, Madhav Khosla, Rohit Dey, all of them have tried, perhaps even Granville Austin before that, all of them have tried to point out to the fact that we at independence adopted a liberal constitution. For the most part, it's true. For the most part, it is indeed true that we have an overwhelmingly liberal constitution with rights, separation of powers, institutional, all of the things that we, that we characterize as features of a broadly liberal constitution. But nonetheless, there is sitting alongside this liberal constitutional imagination that imagines the political community as a, as a contract of citizens, another kind of constitutional imagination, that flips in from this earlier colonial, communal, constitutional imaginary that I've tried to sketch out for you, that flips into our constitutional design and practice. And that's what this book, after having characterized the communal constitution roughly in this fashion, details. Right? I don't know how am I doing for time. Right. Okay. So let me quickly just. So next slide, please. So what I've done is that there are four major chapters in this book. There's a chapter on religious freedom. There's a chapter on personal law, minority rights, and caste identity. In each of these chapters, I try to detail the way in which this communal constitutional imagination of India, understood as an embodiment of a community or communities, flips into these debates. Right now, next slide, please. I could try and just briefly identify the form in which I have tried to elaborate the imprint of the communal constitution in relation to the religious freedom debate, and I do that with the essential practices test, perhaps expectedly, and I sort of go over the constitution. Let me. I'm guessing that all of you are familiar with the essential practices test, and I start with the Gajendra movement in the Supreme Court and its characterization of essential input. In this slide, at least, there is a very, very particular way in which essential practices is identified. There's a move from the earlier positions in the Shirur Math case, I argue, and it's after the Gajendra Gatkar movement that essential practices becomes something of a court-led, something of, it becomes, it's after the Gajendra Gatkar movement that the court becomes something of a theologian trying to seek out religious truth as essential to various religious traditions, and perhaps, one way to think about what's going on here would be to follow Ronajoy Sen's work, where he says that, there's a form in which the high traditions, of the Hindu civilization continuum are reinforced by the court as essential religious practices. It's not entirely true empirically from case to case, but it's roughly true, is my understanding. And that is what, takes place after this moment. There are a whole range of cases after that. The imprint of this case is very, very strong. The Gajendra Gatkar court is very strong on the Supreme Court on religious freedom ever since. And what I do here, so most lawyers would look at this, at this way of characterizing it and say that it's inconsistent with, with the text, with the text of the Constitution, with the, the normative demands of the Constitution, and so on and so forth. What I do is I try to push that kind of analysis to the, and I try to argue that there's something of a reassertion or a re-emergence of communal constitutional imagination that I've just carried, and I'm just flagging both in the Ayodhya case as well as in the Sabrimala case. There could have been alternative ways of approaching the problem of religious freedom, but the court feels that, I don't know whether the court feels compelled to do so. The court actually just does it, right? And so it draws on essential practices and essentializes religion quite in the way that quite in the way that legal imagination in India has been latching on to religion for over 200 years, right? And something of this kind of tension, between a communal imagination and a liberal imagination is what I try to trace in subsequent chapters as well. Right? So I think I'll stop there. I've run over my time. Of course, there's, maybe I'll come back to, so, what is the upshot of all of this? We'll come back to all of this once I've heard from Aparna and Rinku. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just. Thank you so much. To our discussants, Dr. Rinku Lamba has worked at the Center for Political Studies in JNU for over 13 years. She has taught courses in contemporary political theory and the history of political thought, Indian and Western, and has also supervised research work of doctoral candidates in these areas. She previously held visiting faculty positions at Humboldt, University of Würzburg in Germany, and served as an instructor at University of Toronto. Her work focuses on state power, multiculturalism, secularism, and conceptions of religion in India, as well as on the political thought of Ranade, Phule, Ambedkar, and Gandhi.
I think we decided between us that I'll go
you
first.
Go first. Dr. Aparna Chandra is a constitutional lawyer with an expertise in Indian constitutional law, among other areas. She has previously worked at the National Judicial Academy, Bhopal, and the National Law University, Delhi, where she founded the Center for Constitutional Law, Policy and Governance. She has assisted the Law Commission of India in various reports and has been appointed as amicus curiae by the Delhi High Court in matters involving the interface between constitutional and criminal laws. She researches and writes on constitutional law, human rights, gender and the law, and judicial process reform. Her current research focuses on rights adjudication by courts, gender and the law, and empirical legal studies.
Thanks, Aishwarya. And thank you, Mathew, for that very provoking and very provocative book. Let me start by offering a counter proposition. The Indian Constitution is not communal enough. It should be more. And let me substantiate that by through two quotes. One is a quote that you have in your book, and one quote that I want to offer. So on page 76, you're talking about how the Constituent Assembly is engaging with the communal understanding of constitutional representation in the colonial state. And you have a quote from Govind Ballabh Pant, who you say outlined the minority question before the Constituent Assembly in the following manner. And you quote Govind Ballabh Pant as saying, "The question of minorities everywhere looms large in constitutional discussions. Many a constitution has foundered on this rock. It has been used so far for creating strife, distrust, and cleavage between the different sections of Indian nation. Imperialism thrives on such strife." You've emphasized it, I'm emphasizing it again. "It is interested in fomenting such tendencies. So far, the minorities have been incited, have been influenced in a manner which has hampered the growth of cohesion and unity." Right? And really this characterizes many of the themes of your work, of at least the argument that you make, that the framers are trying to move away from this communal conception. Possibly they don't do a good enough job, but in any case, subsequent constitutional practice has failed the imagination that they had of a more liberal egalitarian order. In contrast, I want to bring in Ambedkar, and I have this quote from Ambedkar in States and Minorities, where he is talking again about communal division. And he says, "In India, the political majority is the communal majority. No matter what social and political program it may have, it being the communal majority, the communal political majority it may have, the majority will retain its character of being a communal majority. Nothing can alter this fact. Given this fact, it is clear that if the British system, in this case of parliamentary democracy, was copied, it would result in permanently vesting executive power in a communal majority. It would make the majority community a governing class and the minority community a subject race. It would mean that a communal majority will be free to I'm sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. The administration, to run the administration according to its own ideas of what is good for the minorities. Such a state of affairs could not be called democracy. It will have to be called imperialism." Right? And it's a very interesting counter to what Govind Ballabh Pant is suggesting. Govind Ballabh Pant here and in many of his other speeches in the Constituent Assembly is decrying the tendency to think of Indians in communities. Right? His famous diatribe in the Constituent Assembly is about how Indians have been, for the longest time, thinking of themselves as communities, not thinking of themselves as a group of equal individuals. Ambedkar and obviously his suggestion is that we should move away from communities to individuals, or communal thinking to individual liberal egalitarian thinking. On the other hand, Ambedkar says that these are entrenched identities. These are political identities. Communal identities and political identities are fused together. As a result, we can no longer think of communal identities as distinct from political identities. And if we don't account for it in the making of the Constitution, we are going to further entrench the disadvantages that minority communities have. So we should organize our state in a way that allows for power sharing between the minority and the majority, obviously, therefore, giving salience to these communal identities. And this this sort of contrast led me to think about, I mean, the larger debate in democratic theory between, or the larger conversation in democratic theory on consociationalism, right? And how do you organize democracy in deeply divided societies? The Leibhardt, Horowitz, that kind of literature. And I was just wondering, therefore, what is the question I had, and the question I was left puzzling at the end of the book is, how do you not be communal when over 200 years and 250, 70 odd years now, all of politics has been organized around communal identity, right? Shouldn't we then account for those identities, give salience to them, and therefore protect against the ill effects of those identities, as opposed to moving away from them and having a more liberal egalitarian order, so on and so forth, that Govind Ballabh Pant, for example, is talking about, right? So do we account for them? Do we make them more salient? Just because they have become political identities. By the end of the late colonial period, communal identities are no longer just communal identities. They are also political identities. So what do we do with that? And a second related question, and I will stop there, is again the liberal communal divide, right? I was, again, interestingly, I don't want to put too much on Govind Ballabh Pant, but this quote sparked a range of reflections. But the other thing that this reminded me of was, of course, Aditya Nigam's Text Without Author, where he takes on Govind Ballabh Pant and Govind Ballabh Pant's characterization, or Govind Ballabh Pant's speeches as being characterized as indicative of this liberal egalitarian order. And he says, of course, he looks at the context in which he is making many of these speeches, and makes the point, of course, that the erasure of community markers that he is talking about is all in aid of having a homogeneous national culture, right? It is not in the aid of recognizing multi-ethnicity or multiculturalism. He's in fact against that. And he's asking for a homogeneous constitutional and national culture. And again, from the vantage point of 2023, homogeneous national culture rings very differently from what it might have in 1950. So I just wonder to what extent the liberal script that you see in the Assembly debate is actually liberal, or would you agree with others that is hiding its own form of communalism under the guise of liberalism, under the guise of sameness, under the guise of sort of formal liberal equality? So those are the two sort of questions I had, and I wonder what your thoughts are.
So my comments might be a little longer, and I'm just going to read them out. But thanks, Mathew, for that rather intriguing title. I started with a lot of skepticism and anger. Like, how can there be a title like this? Why not at least a question mark next to it, so that we leave it open for discussion? But as I read it, I see that you temper your own claims a lot on the one hand, and as I will say at the very end, I think there's a very intriguing sense of the term communal that is very relevant to the most contemporary understandings of the term religion on the subcontinent. So keeping some of these things in mind, I'm going to read out a bunch of things now. Put my glasses on. Is it the case that the conceptual structure of the Indian Constitution, and especially its aspiration to acknowledging equal respect for pluralistic conceptions of the good life, reproduces an imagination of religious communities of the kind associated with the curatorial colonial gaze? The title of the book by itself would have the reader imagine that the author's answer to this question is yes. And some portions of the book do lead in this direction. But the substance of each chapter does not lead to the answer yes, and frequently the author himself admits to it. So I would argue that the book actually responds to another set of questions as follows. What were the modalities of the colonial administrative response to concerns about social reform and about the production and management of heterogeneity? To what extent are the processes related to those modalities present in independent India's constitutional politics and especially in the discourses produced by the Indian judiciary via reliance on the essential religious practices test. The book contains of how the use of that test tends to entrench a sense that Indian society is best understood in terms of a division among religiously defined communities. I think this second set of questions, which I think is really responding to, are not any the less important, but there's tension in the book. The author appears between addressing these more specific questions with regard to independent India's judiciary's use of the essential practices test on the one hand, and on the other, tone to extending the ambit of the response to these specific questions to generate a more comprehensive claim about Indian constitutionalism, constitutional politics, and communalism more generally. This pull poses a problem with which I want to offer some comments about this well-argued and clearly written book. In the book, Mathew is concerned about a communal orientation that he would argue pierces through the Indian Constitution. What is this communal orientation? It refers to the potential within constitutional politics to, and I quote you, to delimit religion or a religious community by searching for its axiomatically organized foundational truths, end of quote, and to then use such delimitation for modeling the Indian people, as you call it, or for mapping India. Mathew is concerned about how issues such as the regulation of personal law, the identification of minority rights, and questions of caste have interlocked, to quote again, reinforce a communal conception of the Indian people, end of quote. But what is this communal conception of the Indian people? Part of it has to do with the presupposition that members of different religious communities in India organize their lives around norms grounded in scriptural authority. An example of this presupposition is in the orientation of the regime of personal laws and in the view that personal laws are grounded in scriptural authority, which the courts cannot change. To put it differently, to quote you again, a doctrinally and axiomatically organized conceptualization of religion forms an integral part of the manner in which the Indian Constitution models its people. Across colonial and post-colonial India, there has been this communal characterization and division of the Indian people, and this continues to be a powerful way of approaching the place of personal law in contemporary Indian law, end of quote. But what is the problem with such an orientation? What's the problem with the communal orientation which the book wants to draw attention to? And much before that is the question about why is this orientation called communal? In India, do we have a common sense understanding, understanding of communalism as a certain kind of hostility among religious groups, which, when enacted via institutions or by individuals, can result in the erosion of the vital interests of the parties involved? But the author needs to spell this out. Is communalism an ideology or a doctrine that is tied to a hierarchically oriented understanding of pluralism on the one hand, and an internally coherent understanding of each entity's worldview in that ranked pluralism? So religion, comprehensive view, comprehensive and tight, essential tenets possible to be discerned, that kind of thing. How does pluralism connect with communalism? I'd like to hear the author say more about this, especially in light of some of the remarks that I'll make at the very end of my comment. So now that we have some sense of what communal conception may refer to, and while we wait to know why something is called communal, I want to ask some more questions. What is the problem with the communal orientation, and is it a matter of concern? Is the concern related to resonances of the term communal in the Indian context? One concern or problem with communal orientation in the book, as presented by the author, is that it has a genealogy that can be traced back to a colonial vision of Indian society. So the author presents a discussion of the discourses around the abolition of sati in colonial India. That discussion is accompanied by an unreasoned acceptance of the view that colonial policy toward religious identity was indeed grounded in a notion of toleration. Just because they said it was toleration, can we accept it was toleration? Was that toleration? So I'm asking for a little bit more strictness with reference to the use of the word toleration to depict what the colonial power was doing. But not only that, there's also a very unreasoned agreement with the view that something like toleration can be presupposed to be a value original to the Protestant Reformation. Through these discussions, the author goes on to show how some, but not all debates, I would argue, of social reform in colonial India generated the sense that Indian society could be understood to consist of people divided along lines of religion, where people's actions were guided by scriptural authority, and rulers had to scrupulously know what the essentials of that authority might be, otherwise they wouldn't be tolerant enough. The colonial habit entailing casting disputes in ways that would project Indian society as one divided along lines of Hindus and Muslims. Incidentally, this was a presupposition of colonial historians too, as Kaviraj points out, portrayed the Indian past as a continuous period of hostility between irrationally irreconcilable religious communities, and modernity was seen as some kind of end of that conflict. But the author does not use these frameworks to evaluate or consider what has been labeled as toleration in the colonial period. Rather, the author wants the reader to note the formal connection in terms of origins between the colonial and post-colonial preoccupation with understanding the sociology of India as structured along groups whose members are led by scriptural authority, and toleration there entailed maintenance of such an order. However, a discussion of how something that began as a curatorial intervention in the colony can come to acquire a life of its own. And I think this is a little bit close to what Aparna was saying about the need to be more communal, perhaps in some ways, but not exactly the same point. So something that has origins in curatorial interventions in a colony can come to have a dynamic life of its own over time because of other discourses. And it can come to be connected with justice-based claims for religious and cultural accommodation, as is the case, since the time of the Constituent Assembly debate. A singular focus on the point about the colonial origins of a particular practice runs the risk of claiming that origin implies destiny when it comes to weighing the worth of institutional arrangements for the accommodation of diversity. And I suspect the author does not want to take that route in the discussion. You don't want to say that origins is destiny. I'm hoping or I'm suspecting. As things stand, then, the book produces analysis that can connect features of Indian secular practice, like legal pluralism and the essential religious practices test, to colonialism. This could raise questions. Are some features of Indian secular practice, including the wanted distinction of legal pluralism, the wanted institution of legal pluralism, of colonial vintage and therefore suspect? So a question here arises about the essential religious practices test. That test, is it completely dispensable by the judiciary? I'm thinking of the debates in the US where scholars lament the speed with which courts there set aside issues on the grounds that that would entail intervention in religious matters, which courts of law seem to be incapable to adjudicate. This question about the extent to which something like the essential religious practices test is dispensable is worth opening up, and the line for it is already present in Mathew's work in his evaluation that aspects of Justice Indu Malhotra's perspective in the Sabrimala case present actually a salutary example of the way the essential religious practices test can work. So an exciting issue remains implicitly discussed only. Finally, does attention to the colonial vintage highlight any sole logics for legal pluralism as analytically linked only to the production of images of society driven along adversarial group identity? I don't think so. I think that this is there's enough. I'm just going to quickly again recall Shefali Jha's work on the Constituent Assembly debates and the reasons why some kind of pluralism was thought of as necessary, and also the work of Gopika Solanki, Flavia Agnes, for whom legal pluralism doesn't refer only to the reproduction of some kind of communally ordered forms of life, even if that may have been part of the history of that institution. The other problem is that the book tends to focus on what you call judicial labors alone. So much of the text is trying to produce an answer to what is constitutionalism by only looking at the courts. And that is not the whole thing. The rule of law as constitutional dialogue or constitutional democratic dialogue as involving many different institutions. And also, how does constitutionalism function within a polity where there is civilians movement that's asking for a not uniform civil code-oriented state of affairs? All of those things are germane to thinking about forms of institutions, their colonial antecedents, and their present relevance on grounds of justice. So I'm going to end, I think something is just lost here. So I'm going to end my comments by noting what else aside from colonial origins the author judges to be at stake in the putative communal orientation of the Indian Constitution. So, if what's wrong with the communal orientation, it's colonial, and if it's colonial, there were all those issues that I raised. But what else? I think the author provides an extremely interesting and thoughtful response in the very brief conclusion of the book. Conclusions must be brief, but this one's an outstanding conclusion because it has the space to actually have become a full chapter, which would have lent the book, I think, even more bite than it already has. So what do I mean there? In that conclusion, the reader is introduced straightforwardly to how a communally oriented constitution can pose challenges for a liberal understanding of community that prioritizes equally free citizens. The other challenge posed by a communal orientation is the way it diminishes the possibilities for pluralistic, decentralized orders of the kind associated by the author with Gandhi's views. These orders have lesser space for what the author calls, within quotes, an axiomatically organized account of the Hindu tradition, for example. And these kinds of orders can put paid to homogenizing understandings of religious community. I wish this had been a full-fledged chapter in the book, but why do I say this? Because Mathew's identification of the opportunity cost of a communal constitution in terms of the way it undercuts pluralism is particularly valuable, and it opens up avenues for discussion, not so much of a communal constitution, but of communalism itself, especially of the way communalism can be conceptualized to cohere with certain understandings of religion itself, the kind of understandings of religion that I think Mathew associates with the project of colonialism. Rajiv Bhargav's latest book called Reimagining Indian Secularism, really slim book and a very important one, is a conversation partner that Mathew may want to consider in this context. Bhargav's work invites a fulsome discussion of the notions of religion that can connect with inclusionary and exclusionary monotheisms, and of the extant conceptions of religion on the subcontinent within a context of which something like communalism could be engaged more fully. And this would require reckoning afresh with the work of scholars like Ashish Nandi and T. N. Madan, but also thinkers like Tagore and Gandhi. But that is work to be done, and I think it is rather exciting that your work opens up space for questions about those issues. So thank you.
Right. So there's two very rich responses, and I'm still trying to digest them, and I'm not sure if I can even respond fairly to your comments, or adequately to your comments. So Aparna, I think the point that you're trying to put on the table is that these are identities that have been with us now for far too long. They're just too entrenched. They're there. What does one do about them, right? Now, the point that I think I'm trying to put on the table is that that's really not my concern, right? Of course, it's there, and of course I can see it. But what I'm trying to do is provide us with some kind of theoretical, descriptive, analytical framework to talk about the way in which an imagination of the Indian people that came to us from the colonial state continues to be with us, right? And so that takes me to something that Rinku touched upon as well, where she talks about my brief mention of Gandhi, right? What I've tried to do in the concluding chapter is to draw on precisely people like Chatterjee and Kaviraj, to say that there is a continuum along which one can think of what is the character of the Indian people that have and could authorize Indian constitutionalism. And I'm trying to say that perhaps, arguably the most influential has been the liberal form of characterizing India as a constitutional compact. Right? We are a compact of citizens. And I'm trying to say that repeatedly, and what I'm trying to do is provide some kind of descriptive analytical counter, right? So it's a kind of fault line between liberal, this liberal imagination and the communal imagination. The continuum extends further. It doesn't stop there, right? You can think of India as lots of scholars have, like there's Chatterjee and Sharat Pillai, and there's this Purushottam, Sunil Purushottam, and various other people who talk about India as a federal, India as a federal people. There are others who talk about India, the Gandhian type of alternative, India as a plural people, right? So it is the, it's almost, I think Shalmoli, who's not here today, but she's written something about a headless king, right? As a way of thinking about the nature of the Indian people, right? So it's against that continuum and perhaps there are other ways of thinking about the nature of the Indian people that have and could authorize Indian constitutionalism. I picked on two extremely influential ways of characterizing the Indian people over the last 200 years, and talked about the ways in which they are in tension with each other in our constitutional imagination and in its practice. Right? I started off with this, I sort of like floundered a little bit in like sort of pulling it together, but trying to understand the pluralism of Nanak Das, the Gujarati Dalit poet whose song I read out in the beginning, and the nationalism that has taken over that way of being with our religious traditions. Right now, I have not I have not explored what what this communal imagination means for those broader plural imaginations of the Indian people. Right? To me, that's a subsequent project, right? Which is why there's just a hint of it, or a there's a brief taster of it in the in the conclusion. I hope to explore that in greater detail in future. Right? But for now, it is this perhaps terse, perhaps inadequate, theoretical, analytical, descriptive, outlining of a particular way of thinking about the Indian people that continues to be with us, and at some level, it is also the basis for Hindutva constitutionalism, right? It is precisely this colonial imagination of the Indian people, the fact that we are organized as distinct ethno-majorities, Hindu, Muslim, and so on, that Hindutva imagination draws on, right? And it's that it's also to that concern that that I've focused in this very narrow way on trying to conceptualize the communal constitution in this way to try and trace its consequences, right? And there are all kinds of limitations that you pointed out too, some of which I'm interested in, some of which I don't think I can undertake, and that's really the only way in which I think I can deal with the range of comments that you put together, which is to go back to what I'm trying to do in characterizing the Indian Constitution as as also a communal constitution, right? So it's one amongst a range of dispositions that that can be latched upon by political projects to say that this is what authorizes our attempt to come together as a people. And yeah, I think I just leave it at that, and I think we should just continue this conversation. But thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much. We can now open for questions. Maybe we can do a round with the live audience and then open to the online audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I can hand you the mic. Any questions? Perhaps the online audience would like to jump in. I know Rochna had her hand up a little while ago.
Guys, I don't know if you can hear me. I have a terrible internet connection. Am I audible at all?
Perfect.
Okay, great. No, it's great to see the book and great to see you all. Thank you very much for really interesting discussion. So I haven't read the book and my remarks will be ignorant as a result, but I was really interested that you've chosen to, as it were, highlight the communal elements. And in my own work, what I've tried to do is to suggest that there is, in a way, a tension, an unresolved tension in the Constitution between the liberal individualist elements and the more communitarian or communal elements. And of course, one way of seeing that project is to see that, that is a tension that's sort of left unresolved in the Constitution itself. But is it the case in your claim, in the claim that you're making, that it is actually much more communal, not just its development over time in with regard to the judiciary, which of course it's very clear there. But is it your case that in the constitutional text itself and its key principles that we can see much more of a communal orientation? And what are the specific textual and other deliberative elements that you draw upon to make that case? It's, as I said, it's a question from ignorance because I've not had a chance to read the book. But congratulations, first of all, on doing it. It's a really, really important subject, and it sounds like a fascinating book.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rochna. So the way in which I try to characterize the communal constitution, I don't know with what degree of success I try to explain. I try to say that the communal constitution draws on, that's carried over, right? The tendency to tolerate, the tendency to reform, and the tendency to, and the disposition to represent, and each of them are unique forms of speaking about the nature of the Indian people. In a manner of speaking, one could say that Articles, one could say that Article 25 pulls together some of these aspects of the communal constitution. But it's largely, as you're saying, it's pulled together by, in the Constitution of Independent India, it's largely judicial interpretation and practice that I draw on. The last chapter on caste, perhaps has a little more warrant in the text of the Constitution itself, but even there, it's the president's, right, that identifies caste groups as being Hindu, and then of course that gets progressively expanded to include, their first Sikhs and who the others, Buddhists as well, right? So yes, at some level, you have pointed to something that I ought to consider quite, perhaps a little more seriously than I have in the book, which is that perhaps there is far more practice than there is the structure and design of the Constitution itself, right? But nonetheless, I do think that there are continuities, and courts seem to draw on those continuities as they elaborate constitutional practice. So I suppose that's how I would understand what's going on. And thank you for your question. Good to hear your voice.
But it's great to hear, yours as well. I was just going back to, because you may want to deny decline what I've suggested and have say what Aparna was suggesting, that in fact the liberal voice that is predominant in the debate is also a Hindu voice. It's a communal, that it is a communal voice in that sense, so that's another way to read it. I would hesitate because all the work, and in fact the work we are doing collectively in PACT as part of our research is to also see how the Hindu voices are held at bay with great difficulty and with limited success in the writing of the text. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, but I do think it's worth, certainly if your characterization is based on subsequent interpretations of the Constitution, to point to how the liberal voice can be appropriated by a dominant, if you like, religious or cultural group, in this case Hindu, right? So that's, I mean, and that's the criticism, and just not just in the Indian case, but in the French case, that French republicanism is Catholic, etc., or that sort of, yeah, adherence to a sort of a colorblind constitution is not really sustained in practice, in either judicial practice or in political practice more broadly. But I'll stop there.
Right. I was trying to pull that down to an example, right? I mean, the point that Roshna is pointing us to, will the liberal voice be a Hindu voice? You know, as Ambedkar was trying to point out in the quote that you read out for us. I mean, it's really.
He's responding to political safeguards, right? And he's the demand for political safeguards. Of course, Rochna has really done the work on this, but the demand for political safeguards in the Constitution to be in the electoral model, in representation within the legislature, within the executive, within the services, all of that. And I mean, look at the reality today. Right, look at the representation of Muslims in Parliament. Look at the Sachar Committee report and the socio-economic condition. Where is it in this first past the post plural system, which the framers put in place precisely because they are saying that, you know, we are one person, one vote, one value. We cannot have systems of separate electorates. Put that to the side. Even proportional representation. That the entirety of our imagination is to have unity. That community should be suppressed. Otherwise, this is sectarianism. This will lead to separationism. Is precisely the reason why they move away from, at least that's what they're articulating in the Constituent Assembly. They're moving away from these political safeguards that they themselves recognize in the first draft, and move away to a more homogeneous idea. And they're using the liberal script, and that is, I mean, in some senses, that then becomes criticism. But if you look at the context in which they're using the liberal script, it is to deny the political reality of minorities then, and that's clearly come off, that's paid off in the present.
Yeah. So congratulations, Mathew, and thank you for this book and for this discussion. I had a thought in relation to your chapter on family, on personal laws, which I was thinking about how to articulate until Aparna's intervention, I think, gave me some ground to stand on, right? Where you said this is not communal enough. There has been a what I'm trying to think of is the idea of reclaiming the communal identity as a form of resistance, which has been in recent years used by the Muslim community we've seen this during the Citizenship Amendment Act protests and so on, but has also actually historically been done for the last, so after Shah Banu and the events of the 1980s, by Muslim women's collectives. And the decision in the Shaira Bano, which you describe, which you engage with at some length in that chapter, is also very interesting because it's a culmination of a switch that takes place where in the Shah Banu case, there's an attempt to make a claim through secular law, right? Through section 125 of the CRPC, as a Muslim woman trying to claim a right to equality. After the communal turn that happens in Indian politics, what happens is, and a number of people have documented this, including Agnes and Sylvia Vatu, that Muslim women in the secular, they stop using secular methods and they start asserting as Muslim women. right? Including explicitly foregrounding their religious identity along with the sort of the gender quest, right? So then the claim for equality then turns inwards towards Muslim law itself, and hence a claim like Shaira Bano, which is looking to challenge the practice of triple talaq itself, and not looking outward in terms of an articulation toward which was the preceding model of gender justice that had been followed in the first wave of feminism in India. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the reclaiming on this idea of reclaiming communal identity as a form of resistance, especially by minorities in an increasingly sort of majoritarian political space.
Yeah, thanks. Is it also a related question? In this case, let me just, I think they're both connected questions. So at one level, my response is that, I really don't speak to this problem, right? And I don't have a good enough answer to this problem because that is not what I'm grappling with, right? And as I was trying to say before, what I'm trying to do is provide some kind of descriptive, theoretical, analytical frame to think about different, it's about diagnosing different, the emergence of a particular way of characterizing who the people are, right? And that's roughly what I do. Now, this is actually responding to a real problem of underrepresentation, which is a challenge that I do not take at any point in the book. So it's a problem. There are examples that can come, which I have gone on, but the problem as such of representation for gender just laws and so on is a problem that I have more or less consistently, right? And so that's why you just don't find answers to these problems in what I've tried to do, right? Now the of this would be that you could say it's not communal enough, but you do see the monstrosity in the room, right? You do there is the elephant in the room. There is a nationalist, an aggressively nationalist imagination of the people that has real purchase in legal imagination as well, and that's really that's a thing that I do. And there is on the other side, there is the as once again to point to the tension, Ram, the Maryada Purushottamam, versus Ram, the emblem of an excluding national. The effects of the latter are apparent for us, and that's really what I'm trying to latch on. Perhaps a way to narrow form of engaging a problem, but that's really what I'm trying to get to. So it's at some level, to that extent, it's some kind of descriptive ground clearing exercise that I've tried to do in this book, and hopefully maybe get to some of these problems that all of you are putting on the table for me in.
So John, I'll just give a brief disclaimer before I ask my question. First is that I'm still making my way through the book, so I'm asking this question with the hazard of having you repeat something that you've already answered in the book. And second being that my understanding of political philosophy is still a little flimsy, so if I'm making a very elementary mistake, I would be grateful if you could correct that. But my main concern is with respect to how we are characterizing liberal constitutionalism in a sense, which has an individualizing feature of sorts against a communal imagination. So how I have seen the development of liberal constitutionalism is that there is this very traditional idea of liberal constitutionalism, which is a very strict divide between the public and the private sphere, a very strict idea of what is vertical rights, what are horizontal rights, and then also this individualizing feature. But it also seems that with the ideas of social transformation through law coming into picture, liberal constitutionalism has waded through a lot of critiques by transforming itself in certain ways. For instance, that now there is less concerns, for instance, with the state entering into the private sphere to, say, reform public life. In similar vein, when we talk about liberal constitutionalism having an individualizing feature and the tension that you point out in the very first chapter, My concern is, can liberal constitutionalism not sustain the communitarian idea, in the sense that this is something that you also point out and you refer to, I think, Kimlika. But my concern is that when we portray the debate as liberal constitutionalism versus a communal imagination, uh, is it a binary in that sense? Are these two things oppositional? Can a liberal constitution not have a communal imagination in itself?
I haven't read your book, but I just want to ask you if you touched upon this in your chapter on caste identities, was it? So my observation is that the untouchable now are an individual or communal. I would see this in two ways. One is that there was conscious communalism existing, and there was an unconscious communalism. And Ambedkar's call was basically to awaken the untouchable masses to gain a consciousness of communalism in order to realize their individuality. So therefore, first, reclaiming, I would say, I mean, this is claiming individuality in itself. Look, your what do you mean individuality from the untouchable point of view? So yeah, so communalization of the untouchable comes out of this sort of necessity. And I feel that this can be the only counter to majoritarian communalism. But, and also that individualism and communalism are not necessarily against each other, but communalism helps to realize that individualistic identity for the untouchable at least. But is it the same case for sorry, suppose? Yeah.
Love to read the book. It's just coming through your presentation. So, how to see this book? How to see this reading of Constitution? Is it situated in our social political context where there are these two important questions? One is the caste question, and the other one is the Muslim question. And you are trying to navigate through these two questions and provide a reading of constitution, and why, and sometimes these two questions will not reconcile, because if we see the scholarship, uh, talking about caste sometimes has been read as deepening the democracy. On the other hand, talking about religion or invoking religious identities will be seen as an element of communalism, the pejorative communalism. So you are trying to reconcile with these two questions, the Muslim question and caste question, and the trying to navigate through. So how to read this reading of yours. And related to that, I would also like to bring in focus two images. So one image where Ambedkar writes Dalits, celebrating Ambedkar's statue, holding Constitution in the hand, and the other image is the Shaheen Bagh women protesters carrying Constitution to again reclaiming some voice within this democracy. So I'm just confused. Where are you locating yourself politically when you are reading Constitution? Certainly, I'll read the book to get.
slides through which I talk about the way in which an imagination of the people is expressed and articulated. Right. So that's but nonetheless, it's deeply motivated by the troubling nationalization of our time. Right. And I'm trying to say that there is this national imagination that's taking over the public sphere, as it were, and it has some kind of colonial antecedents. Is perhaps the direction in which I'm trying to point us towards. Now, to come back to the first question, liberal, communitarian, communal, where the moment you think of a political project as underwritten by the people, there is some community. Right? So liberal and communitarian, I understand as variants of each other. So the communitarian project is an attempt to incorporate into liberalism, the fullness of community. But the communal constitution, as I understand it, is to identify the people with community, which is quite a different thing. So the communitarian project is consistent with individual rights. Right? It just grants for group. There is a certain granting of concessions to groups in a broadly liberal background. And the communal constitution, I'm arguing, is different from the liberal communitarian distinction and debate. That's an ongoing debate in Western liberal political theory, as I understand it. I'm no expert. I'm not, to my limited understanding, that is the distinction between the liberal and the communitarian, and separate from them is the communal imagination, which I am tracing to the colonial state. So there's a different place from which that imagination is coming from, and I've tried to trace how that imagination takes shape in this hypothesis that I put on the table. Like, you may agree or disagree with the hypothesis, but that's the place from which it comes. Right? There is, toleration, and of course, I should talk to Rinku more about what she says is an inaccurate.
We will have to end there. We're quite over time, but I would like to thank everyone for their engagement, especially Mathew for being here today. Thank you also to Rinku and Aparna for their rich comments, and I hope we can continue the discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aishwarya, and